It's my absolute pleasure to be here with these wonderful co-panelists and to engage in a conversation about politics, policy, and the fine print. And I wanted to start by thanking Sphinx for this marvelous opportunity to get together and discuss these issues of the day. And to be here present with these panelists, this is Heather Noonan and Omari. And sadly, Blake Anthony could not join us today due to the impending weather and sends his regards. I'd like to start really just by talking about the moment that we're in, hard to ignore, and the purpose of involving politics and policy in this conversation. And I'd like to first ask Heather to introduce yourself and your work in that context and how you are working with existing tools and with new tools to meet this moment.
Sure, thank you. And thanks to Lesley for organizing how we'll spend this time. I'm also going to be asking you some questions because I know you've got answers for how we move through the cycle we're in. So I'm the Vice President for Advocacy with the League of American Orchestras. We're the national service organization for the more than 2,000 orchestras across this country. I am in Washington, D.C. I've been with the League for many years, and I'll say two resources that I've used over time is the power of partnerships and coalitions has been essential to all of the work that we do. So we're very closely networked with the other national arts organizations, but we're crucially partnered with other associations that are well beyond the arts. So when we're working in the music education space, we partner with education reform organizations. When we're advancing the artist visas, we're working with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. We have a seat at the table at Independent Sector, where the nonprofit and philanthropic community collaborates on policy, right? So any experience I've had over my time at the League has been really fueled by those partnerships. And I also have to mention, there are two of us in our Washington office. My colleague of almost 20 years now is Nejin Lee, who leads our work on immigration assistance and so many other things. So also having a really constructive partner, especially in moments like this where you're really called upon to build resilience, has been pivotal. So I've been at the League for 30 years, and I've seen several political cycles of challenge at the federal policy level. Some parts of this feel familiar, and like we've got some tools to use here. I'd say we learned so much during the pandemic about how to mobilize our creative workers as influencers in the policy process. We might come back to that a little later. We also take a really wide lens on what arts policy is. So I've already named a few issues, some like music education you'd naturally think of. But now we're in the space of ticket fraud, right? We're working on protected species material and musical instruments crossing borders. And in each of these cycles, these disruptive cycles, you really have to prioritize your issues, and it can be very challenging because the policy's happening to us in a lot of ways, right? But we have these partnerships to help us do that, so we can take a wider lens. This is also disruptive in a way we've never seen before. And one of the familiar things that I'm really grateful to see is happening again is the Congress is taking a bipartisan approach to supporting the arts as a backstop to these threats and challenges. Just this week, the funding bill for the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities was signed into law with level funding for both agencies. This was the work of continuous advocacy by local constituents talking to policymakers on both sides of the aisle, right? So this is a tool that this nonpartisan approach to the arts policy is a tool that we'll keep using. But we're now seeing the courts engaged in policymaking at the federal level to a degree I've not experienced in my career. So we have to think about what does that muscle look like and how do we fit into it. So just some thoughts about familiar and new.
Marvelous, thank you so much. Omari, I think of you as an innovator's innovator and a creative's creator. So if you could please share with us your thoughts, not just about the existing models, but where you're taking the sector next.
I'm walking alongside people as people take their next steps in our arts and culture sector, and really honored and proud to do that work alongside a really great staff team at Culture Source. We have a great board. We have great members. I feel really lucky to be in the community that I'm in. Yes, so my name is Omari Rush. I'm the executive director of Culture Source. Culture Source is a coalition of creative people and cultural organizations. We're based in Detroit, Michigan here, but we serve the entire Southeast Michigan region. The things that work well in our local region, we actually then spin out and offer to people nationally too. We think about national service rooted in our local practice. That's from Laura Zabel at Springboard for the Arts, that framework. As we are working locally, we are seeing lots of things change. We're only seeing increasing complexity. That complexity comes in part from just a bigger world, a more connected world. It comes from, developments in digital technology, changes with climate, demographics. All of these things are making old problems new again. They are really challenging us to slow down and think more deeply about what's happening. The thing that I really like about working at the local level is that there are a lot of things that move very fast and quickly. And so we're able to get in these learning loops and do a lot of iteration and see what's happening on the ground and then react immediately. Try something, fail, try something, succeed, try something, fail. And so we're finding ourselves right now thinking a lot about policy. We've had great national leadership from folks like Heather and her colleagues and peers in the country who have been consistent voices thinking about national infrastructure, speaking with lawmakers in the federal government about what might be. We're now seeing that energy become much stronger locally. I was talking to someone who works in government affairs at a very large nonprofit here in Southeast Michigan. And they were saying that, in the mid-20th century, corporations didn't really have government affairs teams in their organizations, but there was this moment where they realized, there's a lot that we can do if we have this capacity on our staff, if we start to contract lobbyists and engage them in certain ways. And it's really changed what corporations have been able to achieve, policies that they've been able to push through. And there is this sense that is now coming to local communities, local organizations, where working in policy, having someone in government affairs, policy affairs on staff, or contracting that out to someone who is an expert in that, is gradually just becoming a kind of standard cost of doing business because there's so much opportunity there. So we're finding ourselves thinking more about that, thinking about the intersection of change and policy in our work, and feeling really optimistic.
Well, I love that note of optimism, and we're here to lift each other up as well as explore deeply the issues that face us, and I loved your framing of slowing down and thinking about things in this frenetic world of 24-hour or less news cycles and memes and so much more. We can easily fall into the trap of being facile or superficial. I'll just take a moment to introduce myself since you were very kind to ask me to do so, and we are down a panelist. I'm Lesley Rosenthal. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and the Corporate Secretary of the Juilliard School, and there I oversee what I call the business end of the conservatory, everything from making sure that our facilities and public safety environment set the table as a place of purpose and of joy for our students and our faculty, as well as the operational and administrative back end, making sure that the technology and the human resources are there for everyone to do that work. I'm also working on a number of earned revenue initiatives to help bolster our efforts to bring Juilliard to tuition-free in the near future. Thank you. Alongside that work, I've been developing a practice in what I'm calling arts and the rule of law. I'm trained as an attorney and spent 30 years practicing law. We'll get to the fine print part of this session shortly. But in the meantime, the rule of law is a very powerful concept that is not well enough understood, I think, at that deep level. People bandy about that term in order to justify whatever it is that they're about to say, do, or think. And I want to just bring the idea of the rule of law more broadly to everyone. It doesn't just belong to lawyers and to judges. It's a concept that really says that the law is a level playing field. And that everyone is subject to the same set of laws. It's a really deep part of our social contract. It dates back to Aristotle, and even before that to the Code of Hammurabi. It's shot through the Magna Carta, it's shot through our Constitution, and to visions and commitments all around the world. My thought was to highlight and uplift the role that the artistic sector has played and can continue to play in developing and promoting and spreading the ideas of the rule of law, of justice, of people-centered societies. I was privileged to be able to pioneer a course at the Juilliard Extension Division this fall called Arts and the Rule of Law, where I brought together works of visual art as well as performing arts, everyone from Haydn to Hamilton, to show how artists have embodied, and artistic works have embodied, these crucial principles, like what's the separation of powers? Is that something really dry and boring that lives in the Constitution, Articles 1, 2, and 3, and you learn about in civics class and then you forget about it? No, the separation of powers is what enables us to check and to balance so that no one group or party or branch is running away with the power in a society. Anti-corruption. Artists are great at spotting and calling out anti-corruption in ways that stick in your ear, in your heart, in your eye, in your soul, and it can carry through around the globe to different countries and across the generations. The idea that the courts should be independent and should be fair. That's a really powerful idea that artists have embodied for generations. The idea that there's fundamental human rights that deserve to be called out and protected and called out when they're not being observed. And that artists have a really powerful voice in the struggle for fundamental rights and civil rights. So that's a little introduction about what I'm worrying about and thinking about and trying to promote. Sounds like Omari has a contribution.
Well, it's more like a question. You know, I'm wondering what your sense has been of what's needed. I think about copyright law. I think about this concept of free speech. When we think about fine print and politics and policy, is your sense, is your hunch that everybody needs to just like carry around a copy of the Constitution in their back pocket? Is it that we need to specifically know what we can and can't do from a very technical standpoint? Is there some kind of baseline that use of kind of awareness, civic understanding that needs to be raised or infused into other things? Are there one or two things that you're sensing like we need to be better at or can do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, the truth is that I do carry around a copy of the Constitution in my pocket. Not only that, but I bought copies of the Constitution for all of the students in my class, and I handed them out on the first day because I feel like everybody should have it and know it and feel their ownership of it. But from a more practical standpoint, I've been working on a project funded by the Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation called We Are Bound. And the title of that speaks to me so deeply, both from the perspective of your liberation is bound up with my liberation, and also from the perspective of literal binding contracts. And so many artists are signing contracts because they don't have their own form, or because it was stuck in front of them the minute before they came out on stage, or because everybody else is signing them. So just providing artists with the tools that they need to protect themselves and their intellectual property, their ownership of their own work, and the use of that work into the future, make sure that their livelihood is sustainable. Those are really important tools that I can think of, just getting down into the details of the contracts, the fine print. That is where your power and where your protection are negotiated.
We've, over the last year, almost exactly now, we've been assembling some tools that we're calling ambiguously resources for a changing landscape, which is flexible framing for what's happening over the last year. And we've really been looking to these external experts that have been navigating times like these long before we have. And two of the organizations that are helping to equip individuals with the tools they need to understand those rights, the National Conference on Civil Rights, Civil and Human Rights. It's a coalition of very many national organizations that have long worked in this space, the Legal Defense Fund and others. So we're linking people to the resources that help get them networked up with the other movements that have figured out how to navigate this, and movements where artists have already been centered, really, and bring a new kind of voice to the issues. Another group is the National Coalition Against Censorship, which has some terrific resources that speak right to, I think, what creative workers need to know today. And we're learning a lot from trying to observe these movements that have already been around us. And I learned from Omari last week a really new way of thinking about the life cycle of movements, and that kind of ties back to your earlier question about what's familiar or what's new. And can I just ask you to say a little bit about this?
Sure. The Berkana Institute has this two loops model about the kind of life and death of systems, because newsflash, everything dies at some point. And the two loops represent a dominant system and an emergent system. And as these systems unfold, there are these very clear known phases that they go through. A dominant system goes through a maturation process where it's getting the resources it needs to become really strong and healthy. You think of that as an arc. At the top of that arc, a dominant system is its strongest. This is where things are working very well for a lot of people, most people. These are systems that are reliably enabling prosperity, reliably allowing people to live their lives in certain kinds of ways. That eventually starts to fade. Things just don't, it's hard to sustain certain enterprises and certain ways of life without making change. And so as that fades, there is this thing that happens where we have to think about, well, what do we do with these fading resources? What do we do with these fading institutions as they move into a kind of a hospice phase? We can either have them fade and sunset in a really graceful, dignified way, or it can be painful and we can just experience really sad loss. As things are working in this dominant system, it's not working for everybody. And what we see are a set of innovators and pioneers who drop out of a dominant system saying, I want to explore a new way. These folks often are free radicals that can't see each other because they're doing something so new, so fresh, that it's not named. And so in those early phases, there is this real opportunity to name the work of these pioneers, the work of these innovators, so that they can start to connect with one another. And as they connect with one another, they start to informally learn, informally get certain kinds of inspiration, knowledge sharing, that when nurtured by people who see the potential of that connectivity, nurtured by those connected entities, folks starting to use recycled goods, cheap space, decommissioned space, all kinds of things, they start to get more and more organized and form into some kind of community of practice. That community of practice now looks very well organized. There's all this scholarship around what they're doing. There's all these credentialing. There's been a lot of credentialing and validation of what these, at one point, pioneers and innovators were doing, now looks organized. And as they get more organized and start to really kind of do more and more work together, they become new systems of influence, new spheres of influence, and start to redefine what a dominant system is. And so, as an example, we can see the way in which the traditional print media, print news industry, the kind of rise and fall of that, where you had a set of innovators that were thinking about ways that we could be sharing information online. Gradually, it became known as social media, and now we have these communities of practice where influencers are the new marketers and reporters. Now, newspapers don't exist nearly as robustly as they used to, but people are getting their news in these social media platforms pretty reliably. They're spaces of editorial content, they're spaces of breaking news, and it's now forming a dominant system of information sharing in this country. And so, this is what's happening, and when we think about the local level, we see these changes happening rapidly, and we can react to those things, but then we rely on folks like Heather, who are kind of naturally have a kind of a more global view, to see some of these trends and to see them as trends and help us get ahead of them. And I think right now what we're trying to figure out in some of the rooms that we've been in recently, that I call How to Save the Arts rooms, is how the two perspectives can be in conversation more often, because there have been times where it's been very top-down, not from Heather, but just top-down in terms of how we think as a country about leadership. And I think we're seeing that there's a top-down and bottom-up balance that we can have that can be much more productive.
I mean, there's so many ways to look at this that I'm not sure the arts needs saving. Right? And which is one way I think we've all been kind of saying, okay, is the premise all wrong here, right? It's the, policy in this country is made in a highly decentralized way. Washington, D.C. gets too much of the focus and attention most of the time because, look at education policy, right? This is 95% made at the school district level, and then at the state level, and the federal piece of it, it's important, critically important. Especially where you think about the underlying law of equity in Title I and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. These are fundamental things we want to see continue. But where things are working really well and where there are amazing examples of the arts being an asset and resilient is happening locally. And so to the point you made earlier about let's hire up some government affairs experts, right, that the corporations take. I think in our community, we don't have to hire out for these expertise, right? Artists come to the table as experts in how policy is impacting their lives. They know what healthcare reform means to them. They know what being a gig worker needs in terms of state policy, right? They are the expert in the room. And to the degree they know this and are engaged in the places where the policies are being made, they come with such great assets. And so I think a lot of these conversations we've been kind of listening in on or being a part of is starting to really recognize that networking this power and this strength, creating the community of practice you described is a real opportunity. And probably when you describe that life cycle, this must be why you're feeling optimistic, right? As the innovators and disruptors are starting to connect with each other.
Yeah, and let me just say that I think part of what Heather, what I hear Heather saying is this idea that we all have an ability to shift our perspective about how we see creatives. We think about creatives in a variety of ways, but certainly artists are in that category. And we have an opportunity to rethink or think differently about how we see artists. And in your case, it's really acknowledging the wide range of things that they feel, know, sense, and can give words to, can give image to, can give emotion to that makes it make even more sense.
And you're really making me think that some of this sort of decentralization of power and the invitation of people that have expertise is in our power structures already. We just need to put our finger on it. So we have a federalist system. That means that the federal government doesn't control everything that goes on. We have 50 states that are the laboratories of democracy, that many of which have their own offices of the arts and culture, many of which have their own grant-making programs, many of which are setting the table for not-for-profit organizations to do the work that they do. And even beyond that, we've got cities, urban, and we've got smaller localities, rural towns, where democracy is being practiced at its most essential level. And so I was really interested in hearing your thoughts about this decentralization and the power in that, and linking together people who are doing this work at the local level, and how that can really reinforce and teach and learn from each other.
I mean, this idea of the kind of essential level of democracy is really fascinating. And one of the things that, as people are practicing democracy, we're trying to just make sure that people are always equipped with tools for wrestling with complexity. There are no, especially as we are all sitting shoulder and shoulder in our communities with people that are very different from us, who may have very different values, who may have very different ways of seeing the world. It's really calling us, this idea of practicing democracy at the local level, to be able to slow down and just take a breath, be able to challenge assumptions, be able to invite in different perspectives related to the way that you see a system or see people, from the balcony or from the dance floor, for instance, way that you see people because you've been in touch directly with people that are inside or outside, above or below you, whatever is different. And as we kind of get in touch with those ideas, challenging perspectives, challenging assumptions, changing perspectives, getting more curious, it enables us to start to see some possibilities for what could be. And so as we think about new efforts in policy in our region, we're trying to do more of those kinds of things. We're trying to systematize that work, and we're trying to be consistent about it across many different audiences and groups. Certainly we're thinking about our state legislators, state lawmakers, but we're also thinking about folks who are stakeholders in our field, people who are institutional or individual philanthropists, people who are business owners, even people who are in our sector that have some ability to influence the work, the field, based on the choices that they make in their own organization. So yes, this small is, who says small is all? I think that might be maybe Grace Lee Boggs or Adrienne Marie Brown, one of them.
Beautiful. And your organization, and you have really embodied that idea of developing the local and then connecting people in parallel localities together to realize their power. And I know that, Heather, your organization, and you've been there a long time, but you've got this incredible fluidity of mind and of action. And I just wanted to ask you how this decentralization is working within your organization, and in your mind, what's the future of it?
Sure. And some of this kind of connects to the fine print part, too. So at the federal level, when we were working on pandemic relief, it was coming at it. This was the largest, most rapid policy formulation at the federal level that we've seen in generations, right? Not to mention the largest direct investment in the arts ever through the Shuttered Venue Operators Grants Program, yeah. But as all this was happening, we had questions around direct relief, and then also for especially coming from a part of the sector that has some of the largest numbers of creative workers employed when you think about orchestras, right? So the employee retention tax credit might have actually eclipsed dollar for dollar the relief provided in the arts compared to shuttered venues even, right? Or it could be really close to it. Getting the comma in the right place in that ERTC, getting the and to be an or, making sure it could work for a nonprofit model. The fine print matters, you know, and this might be where getting some expertise, legal help, really is important. But at the federal level, what it does is unlock opportunities at the state and local level for federal-state partnerships and funding, right? This happens in education policy. So where this leads me is there are networks and coalition partners at the state and local level who can help make those same kinds of really important adjustments together. So most states have a Music Education Advocacy Association. All of them have a National Council of Nonprofits. Very many of them have after-school alliances that are doing this work in the state legislature. And I would say getting plugged into those broader networks, this is where it's taking us, as helping to build the advocacy capacity really from the local level up. And most of that does happen in coalition, it happens in partnerships. Because if you can get the fine print right, most of the policy problems aren't caused because someone isn't a fan of the arts. It's because the arts weren't even on the table when the conversation took place and the policy happened to us, right? So I think just being able to build this capacity and this network community of practice around feeling really comfy, having advocacy a part of your job description is where we're going. Yeah.
This panel was brought to you by the letter P. Politics, policies, and the fine print. I wanted to add one more P, and that is pensions. And providing for the long-term health and safety and protection of older arts workers. And the pension plan, for example, of the American Federation of Musicians, AFM, and several other pension plans in the creative sector were in pretty dire straits before the pandemic. There's a term within ERISA law, the pension law, called critical and declining, and that was what was happening to their balances, and it was going to threaten the future livelihood and the old age protection of people that had been contributing to those pension plans for decades. And I had always said before the pandemic that if it were Major League Sports whose pensions were in critical and declining state, the federal government would have jumped in quickly to take care of that, and yet here we are, and we're not being paid attention to in the same way that Major League Football is. But during the pandemic, yes, indeed, through the wonderful lobbying efforts of Heather's organization and many others, the artistic sector pensions got to the table and were then infused with support and capital and assistance so that they are now in a much better place. And we can see the impact that that's going to have on older workers in the arts sector and way beyond. So that's just one example of the power of this work and of bringing the artists' voices to the table. So thank you. Omari, I'm just fascinated by the ideas that you've been bringing forth about like the old traditional sort of strategic plan and linear thinking, and what replaces that? Where are we going from here to bring ourselves to a better vision and implementation of a brighter future?
Well, I think there is part of it that is just embracing kind of an inability that has always been, but certainly now more than ever, an inability to predict the future, you know? And so, so we just have to get good at navigating the present. You know, I think I really like podcasts about therapy because they're really fun and uplifting, not really. But in that, one of the things that they talk about is like peak mental health is not thinking about the world as it was or as you wish it to be, but kind of meeting the world as it is. And I think that we have a real moment now to really embrace what it means to meet the world and be in the world as it is right now, and ever better understand what that means, and to try to look at various sides of the coin, whatever the coin is. And so I was just talking to somebody on the phone, a job candidate yesterday, and they were asking us about our work. And these are always really good conversations because they really are poking at me because they want to understand, is this a place that I, want to work? And we were talking about what's happening with the federal government and the ways in which some of the actions by the federal government have really changed, upended expectations of the relationship between the federal government and social service, federal government and nonprofits, federal government and the arts, federal government and all kinds of things. And we're having to think, well, is this just a single moment in time? Or have some of these things, has free speech been challenged actually a lot over the last few decades, 3 decades, that kind of thing, in such a way that we have an opportunity to think slightly more broadly about that. And so in the work that we do, we try to, really be in the moment and really think about what's actually happening, but not be overly reactive, active to that and thinking about the way that we want things to be. I may have completely just contradicted myself. I don't know. But
We're all
yeah.
about the nonlinear.
Yeah. Nonlinear. So we're a fan of people working adaptively, and we think that a lot of the work in politics and in advocacy really calls for that. It calls for a long game, which is partly what Heather has been able to kind of do and navigate so brilliantly.
Beautiful. And we just have a couple of minutes before we're going to ask for some Q&A, and I'd like to invite Heather to wrap up this part of our conversation with another P word, which is proactivity. Where are we going?
Yeah, oh wow, where are we going? Well, we don't know, but that's also, I think, where the opportunity is. One of the things that I've learned over and over again, and I don't know why I feel astonished every time I see it happen, maybe just because it's so gorgeous, but artists will tell us where we're going. And to my mind, they are the most effective advocates just by living their art form every day. So I feel like our mandate as arts advocates are to create the best space we possibly can for artists to thrive right now. And in a lot of ways, I think it's by honoring their voice, honoring their option to not be visible as they're making their art right now, because they have to prioritize their safety and welfare and their sustainability, and being allies so that we can bring their voice forward as they're ready, right? So I think, and I'm tossing it back to you because you've actually been studying the cases in which artists animated the issue of their time and changed the dialogue, right? So you can probably talk to some of those examples, but in my view, really centering, always remembering to center those creative workers and the artists in helping us see the future. Anytime that I hit a wall on how are we going to communicate this policy issue, some of it's really just highly technical and arcane. Mm-hmm. Anytime I bring an artist into the conversation with a policymaker, it's all done. Mm-hmm. Like there's no convincing. Yeah.
The work that the artists can do in these conversations is incalculable, and we've seen countless examples from Nigeria, from South Africa, from Argentina, from Chile, and they resonate all throughout the world. And we just need to make sure that the artists' voices are present, audible, and included. On that note, I'd like to ask if there are folks in the audience that would like to either contribute to the conversation or ask a question. And I'd also like to ask Anne if there are questions from our online friends.
Yes, this question is from the virtual audience. What do current policies allow for and limit in diversity opportunities, for example, fellowships, internships, scholarships? What do organizations need to consider?
So I think, I'm assuming this question is in light of the focus on executive orders, maybe, and some of the definite chilling effects there. So I'm not an attorney, but I will say this: when I mentioned the resources that we've been providing for our field, we link to some resources in our material that point right back to that leadership conference on civil and human rights, where national organizations have been explaining that fundamentally the anti-discrimination laws have not changed. And I think there's been some really helpful guidance written about how organizations and individuals can run a check, a risk analysis, and a compliance check to say, am I still following the law, which was the law 3, 4, 10 years ago, right? And feel more comfortable in living their values around expanding access to participation in all of its forms. So I will say, I think over the last year, we've seen, again, a cycle of pressure testing whether the limitations we're hearing about are in fact real and founded in law, or whether the limitations are more rhetorical. And there are organizations that are here to help with the very specific legal aspects of how do I pressure test the work that I'm doing. But I'm really encouraged that I think what we've been seeing is a consistent commitment to the values that are underpinning all of that work.
I couldn't agree more. I feel like there's so many tools that we have to address this moment. Some of them are very structural and legal, like attacking the enforceability of an executive order that may be either poorly drawn or exceeding the authority of the executive who wrote and signed it. There are ways within our Constitution to challenge the constitutionality of those orders, and that certainly has been a sharp tool. And however, it's a bit of a slow tool because the courts, have their procedures, and it may take a while. And good programs, perfectly good programs, may already end up on the chopping block, or defunded, or disfavored, or proactively by the organizations themselves, sort of compliance in advance, and that's really problematic to me. And that's why I think you need to go through your whole toolkit and not just rely on the one. We've got other toolkits too. We're creatives. We've got all the words, not just some of the words, and maybe DEI is a word that we don't need to be using. Honestly, the word diversity always struck me as being slightly off from what at least I thought we were talking about. Diversification is for portfolios. We're not stocks. We're human beings, and we're multifaceted. And so let's think of some other words that really embody that value and the spirit of recognizing the light and the humanity in each other. So there's a number of ways to go about it. And then the partnerships that you touched on earlier in this session, I think we have ways of collaborating together to reset the dialogue. The day that the big corporations were starting to embrace DEI and throw a bunch of marketing money at it was the day that I started to think, the artistic community is going to take this in another direction.
And I would say, go back to this question that you're kind of bubbling to the surface about language, and Heather, where you ended about the values that undergird. I think the moment that we're in now is just a real invitation for us to get more curious about why in the first place. Like, what are we really saying? What are we really trying to get at? And as an exercise, try not to use any of the words that have been used, or like the first 5 words that come to you. If you can't use those as descriptors for your mission or your own vision, and you have to put together a sentence without those, like, what comes of that, and how does that point at the actual thing that that you're getting to? And I think in terms of this question about how to kind of navigate around some of these new challenges, I think it's just an invitation to get more specific.
A lot of qualified lawyers, which I'm not, again. My email actually has a tagline at the bottom of it that says, not a lawyer. So being really careful here. But the ones that I listen to who speak about this, and from the very beginning have been saying, it's actually a fact that to the degree an organization's commitment to that work was more authentically connected to its mission, there's actually less legal risk. It's in the circumstances where this was maybe superficially added, where it can become less legally defensible. So it kind of is to your point around the curiosity about the why and the connections.
We have a question in the audience, and because we would like to consider you as a co-panelist for having approached the mic, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your connection to the theme of politics, policies, and the fine print as you're asking your question?
Yes. Hi, my name is Maria Gabriela Mendez. I am from Venezuela. I play violin, and I'm doing my master's right now in Massachusetts. So my question is a little bit similar, but I still want to ask it. For artists who enter the field thanks to like diversity-driven initiatives, because of many different reasons, like myself, what happens now when those structures are no longer supported by policy, and how can these institutions or the sector avoid losing that talent?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for that question. Something that we've all been pondering and encountering as federal funding has dried up, although there hasn't, just let's be honest, been a lot of federal funding for the arts for a very long time, and we're a very different situation, say from the arts in Europe or in other countries where there's a culture ministry. That can be a good thing, that can be a problematic thing. So let's celebrate the fact in this moment that there is not a lot of federal money in our sector. And then we, of course, turn to the private sector, which is feeling the challenges of trying to fill in where government money used to be. And they're stretched thin, they're feeling some of that pain also. I hear it over and over again speaking with foundation colleagues. You know, we may need to really be reinventing these funding models anew in every generation. I think of the artists that just moved into abandoned warehouses in Soho in New York in the 1970s, and they were squatters. And guess what? They created this incredibly vibrant world and infrastructure, and suddenly everybody else wanted to move in there. And now I see the influencers, as you call them, but in the artists' world that have access to a gigantic audience that can, without the gatekeepers, put their art out there and have their messages be known. There's a chalk artist from Afghanistan that I follow on Instagram, and she's been putting out the most unbelievable images that are drawing attention to the plight of women and girls and artists in Afghanistan. How would we ever have heard her voice and seen her incredibly moving images without these diversified and distributed tool. So how are you thinking about the question of governmental funding drying up around diversity initiatives?
I think that there's this starting place that is about why artists and why creatives? Like, what can we articulate the value societally, the value within a community, even within our field that we have for artists? And as we can articulate that, I think we take one step forward. And then after that, if we value that, then I think there are a whole set of channels that we can look to make sure that we all benefit from that value and retain that value. And so I think there are fluctuations with all different kinds of systems, and I think there's a certain amount of resiliency in baking in an understanding of and awareness of that. This is on the institution side, for instance, such that one domino falling doesn't make all the other ones fall. And moments like this, I think, show us where we've set up some dominoes and they're all going to fall. I'm not really committed to this dominoes analogy, but I got in the weeds of it and so I had to stick with it. But I think we're learning a lesson, and I think the resiliency and adaptability comes from, one, having that core value, and two, being aware of the many channels that we can go down or tools that we can leverage to support that value.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about building systems earlier, and this goes, I think, directly to that point. You know, we need to take make the long-term commitment to build the systems that will support this, so that it's at the center. It's just at the center of what all organizations do. It's not dependent on a federal grant or one philanthropist's ideals, right? But that's a much longer term answer that probably doesn't feel like it meets the urgency of the moment that we're in right now, I realize. But if we can do both things at the same time, I think there are hyper-local community solutions that are happening to try to be a backstop to this. We want to know more about those so we can see what can we do to help replicate them. But we to take this long view, right, of making sure we don't get to this point where you tip one domino.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. There's one online, and there's a person at a microphone here. So starting with you.
How does one get involved in an advocacy organization for the arts or seek a career in that field?
So one of the best things that happened to me in one of my most anxious times a year ago is I suddenly got this flood of requests for informational interviews from graduate students. They said, how do I get into how can I help? How do I get into this work? And I found that so encouraging, because we fear that people will step away from civic engagement in moments like this that feel so cynical sometimes and challenging. And I'm actually hearing so much around people wanting to take a better role, right, or a bigger role. So first of all, check out your local arts alliance. Check your state's nonprofit alliance, the music education networks I mentioned. Get plugged into advocacy networks that aren't art specific. That is one of the best ways to be engaged. Show up at a school board meeting when the arts are not on the table. You're just there to hear what matters to education in your community, right? It's these everyday advocacy actions that aren't about a bill becoming a law. It's about taking up some space at the civic level. It's by far the best way to make your first step. And you will meet people there who'll say, well, you know, who are you with? Or tell me more about you. You'll say, have something to do with the music industry. And they'll say, why are you here? And explain to me the connection. And that's how it works. And do think about networks that place advocacy at the center of your job description. You don't have to wait to have a job of being a lobbyist or an advocate to be a professional advocate. Just start baking it into the work you do every day.
Be in the room where it happens. Omari?
Well said, Heather.
I was interested that you were saying that you were attending a meeting where the laptops had been banned, and that you were in a classroom where the phones needed to be put away, and that really struck me as such a powerful moment and a turning point in our human-to-human connection and how we network with each other, how we connect with each other, and how we move forward together.
Yeah, being in the room, showing up, I think is very important. Heather is a really great model of that, and so I +1 all those things. And know that there's lots to do in this area, and so any bit of volunteerism also, whether you're doing it professionally or not, the volunteerism is always really well received. Extra voices always help.
Beautiful. And we had
think about running for office.
Oh, yes. Start with local government. Start with your library board. There's oftentimes youth-designated slots on organizations, on funding groups within, especially local arts councils, and just find those moments and be that person. We have one other question live. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, hello. Oh, I don't have to stand that close. Hi, I'm Josh Ellis. I work at a grant-making organization. I work at Creative West. I want to say thank you for talking about this topic and also talking about artists as advocates, because you don't have to be on Capitol Hill to be an advocate. I also wanted to mention that there are your 6 regional arts organizations in addition to your local organizations and your state organizations. You all have regional arts organizations, and so we have a partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts. Each regional arts organization gets some of the budget from the NEA, and we have capacity building, professional development. We do advocacy, and we also do grant making. And so much has changed with grant making lately with this administration and with the executive orders, but they haven't changed who we grant, they just change how. And so we're still making sure the dollars get to where they need to, but we're being very savvy about how we do it without bringing scrutiny, or how do we say it without saying it. So things are still happening, things are still, we still have leverage more than we think. I thought I had a question, but I guess I'm more just like talking.
Can I just say, check out Creative West. My colleague Cynthia Chen there is actually a leader in our national policy circles, and the materials you have available to help people build their advocacy skills are just phenomenal. So to that earlier question of what are some first and next steps, you've really been leading the way in building capacity like that. So thanks for your work.
I would also say thank you to, that's TOO. And, you know, this brings up this point about the ecosystem of the arts. And part of the conversations that Heather and I have been in recently are understanding the internal and external. We have a great need to be better when we think about policy, to be better networked within our field, the local arts agencies, the regional organizations, state arts agencies, state advocacy organizations, the national service organizations, the federal government agencies, all kinds of other service providers, intermediaries. How do we connect and make sure that we know who has the right resource, the right moment, the right time? How are we leveraging the bits of information that we're all knowing to know more as a field comprehensively? And how are we taking some inspiration from former NEA chair, National Endowment for the Arts chair, Maria Rosario Jackson, around cross-sector partnerships? And so how are we also not just existing in our bubble of arts and culture, but also understanding opportunities for the arts to be involved in, continue their involvement in other parts of life, to be instrumentalized, to be just in the room. So how are we getting out of our bubble and doing that? And it's these are the challenges that we're facing right now if we really want to make great progress for the field, in our field. It's really easy to just kind of be in your own organization, head down. We're all experiencing lots of urgent, important challenges day to day. But the ability to make those connections internally and externally is directly correlated to our ability to really see artists, arts organizations thrive.
Just so beautifully put, and a great conclusion to this session. I wanted to thank Josh for that question, because you've really focused us on regional arts councils and organizations, and you've led me to rethink a long-standing phrase, which is to think globally and act locally. And I'm going to change it up now and close you with this thought. Think globally, art locally. And with that, I'd like to thank Heather, and I'd like to thank Omari for this really stimulating conversation, and thank you for being here.